This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We're kicking off this week's programming with our cattle market update for the week from Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Katelyn McCullock. She shares insight on why the markets seem to be down across the board for us and offers a glimpse at anticipated drastic cattle number declines. Also ahead, K-State weed science specialist Sarah Lancaster and southeastern area agronomist Bruno Pedreira let listeners know all about upcoming weed schools across the state. Bruno focuses on the importance of understanding soil conditions, and Sarah highlights the many anticipated changes to come for herbicides. We end with this week's wildlife segment where K-State fisheries and aquatics specialist Joe Gerken highlights bald eagles. He provides a population update on the majestic birds that return to Kansas for winter and shares why you are more likely to spot them near water. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. I am joined now by Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center out of Colorado, Katelyn McCullock. She's joining us for this week's cattle market update. So, Katelyn, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I wish we were starting off with good news for this segment, but unfortunately, we're seeing kind of this downward trend across the board for most markets, right?
Well, for the cash markets, it certainly looks like, especially in your neck of the woods, that it was a little bit of a lull point from what we've seen. Almost across all the weight groups, we saw some price weakness in varying degrees. Some lost almost $10 a hundredweight in Dodge City, the 4 to 500 weight group. 5 to 6s lost a little bit more, closer to $12, etc. So a little bit of decline there, but that's kind of in line with what we have projected. So we have a first quarter average of 178 to 80, and it's pretty close to what they were last week. Dodge City was at 180, 65, 100. So we're right in that area. Those heavier weights, those 7 to 8s and larger are going to really play off the corn market, which has had some volatility as of late. The WASDE came out and changed acres and bushels, as well as you have some dryness in South America that people are very nervous about what kind of crop that's going to produce. And so I think this year cattle market is probably going to see more volatility, especially as we head into a critical time for us in terms of planting. All us economists are trying to become weather people and look at all those different weather charts to determine if we're going to come out of this La Nina and get some moisture, and if that moisture will really be in time to help cattle country. And those are some big ifs. I'm not going to pretend I am a weather person, but I've spent a lot more time looking at those types of maps lately than usually I do.
I was recently chatting with someone about the fact that economists have to be almost jack of all trades, because you guys really do just have to keep up with, the most nuanced things, including the weather sometimes, especially in times like these. So yeah, I applaud you guys for learning those weather skills.
Well, thank you.
But that wasn't the only downward trend we saw, right? We saw this play out in other markets too.
Right. So on the futures market, on the week, I would collectively say the market was down. Friday was a little bit better. Almost all the contracts except for the nearby, which is January, saw some life. They added about 80 cents to the prior day. But overall, the week was down. And for March, it was down about $2 a hundredweight on the feeder cattle. Live cattle across the futures board was largely up, including the nearby, which is February for them. Mixed 80 to 50 cents or so across most of those contracts. And that cash cattle price has been a little bit up and down last week and ended the week at about 155.
We saw up and down kind of trends this week. Do you expect that to continue just because, like you said, a lot of reactionary trends due to other markets, like the grain market sort of thing playing out, or just the time of year?
All of those things. So I'm going to be a little long-winded here, but the feeder cattle probably a little bit more looking at what those feed costs are going to do. We also got December 1 hay stocks last week, which was a huge decline, harrowingly low across the U.S. I mean, it was really depressing for cow-calf country. And on the live cattle side and on the beef side, box beef is starting to decline. I think it hit a peak around $285 for choice, and it's pretty much come down almost every day since then. And we closed last week at about $271.70. So not an awful price by any means, but we're watching things like meat demand, which for the fourth quarter for both beef and pork took a significant hit from last year, which has not been the trend. I mean, all year Beef has moved really well. We've talked about how great beef demand has been, and we're seeing a little weakness now. And so that's got to raise a few concerns about what does boxed beef do from here and how high can those live cattle prices either remain at or go higher. We're not sure yet. Again, we have this price pattern projected of probably relatively close to where they are now. We would actually expect maybe this first quarter to be a little bit lower than that 155 on average. But it's kind of a guessing game. After the holidays, inflation, people felt like they spent a lot of money. Generally, a first quarter is like a belt tightening in terms of expenses. And so you have to wonder if beef is going to see some of that, although it seems like pork demand weakness has really come into play, maybe where they're opting into chicken instead of pork, or maybe they're going to continue to stick with beef. So some pretty big questions. On the year, I think beef demand has been a very supportive thing in the last couple of years, and that's really the risk. Cow supplies are tight. That's going to hold up price. But to really get those huge year-over-year gains like we saw last year's annual average live steer price is 17% higher probably. 17 to 20% higher than the year before. That's a huge, huge increase. We're probably looking at more like 7 to 10% in 2023 and similar gains maybe in 2024. But that demand question is maybe the biggest one out there for me in terms of what beef can do and maybe that interplay between live cattle price.
Yeah, our livestock economist Glenn Tonser brought up the fact that you did too. The holidays, people tend to spend more money around that time. So January tends to be, the month that people are like, okay, we're not spending right now. But he also brought to the surface the point where if people were using credit cards more often than not, then their rates in terms of inflation and everything else going on those cards are even higher now than they were before. So paying those off probably a bit more challenging now. And that just leads to decrease in willingness to spend in other areas, including, meat markets.
The economic data isn't what I would consider rosy. And unfortunately, it's lagged so significantly. You're still looking at, third quarter numbers of 2022. And so it's hard to maybe throw that in a 2023 context quite yet. But if you look at savings rates, we are now down to 2.7% in the third quarter and probably close to 2.5, which is going to be the lowest since before the Great Recession. Wow. Those are very low numbers. And to your point, there's probably a little bit more credit card spending. If you look at that household debt number that comes out every quarter, household debt has continued to grow in non-mortgage areas. And so if you think about all the different policies that have come into play that have been relatively supportive of putting more money in pockets for student loan forgiveness, things like that, those are now payments that they didn't have to make. Any of those types of things, as we move into a new era where maybe some of those costs are still very expensive, but not forgiven or not suspended for a period of time, we're going to start to see more and more household type implications.
Another example of you guys having to be a jack of all trades, understanding those current economic concerns too. But Katelyn, we were talking beforehand about, we know these trends year to year that we look at the calendar and we can kind of pinpoint, we expect to see a drop in markets here. We expect to see high demand here in the summer months. But in a year like this one, where we're kind of in this environment where everything's thrown for a loop, we tend to see that a bit more exaggerated. Is that correct?
It can be. What it can be is also very difficult to pinpoint because you have so many things interplaying together. So in a year where maybe you only are really dealing with drought, that could still be a terrible drought, but we've seen drought before and we understand those implications. This is probably going to be a larger global recession type impact and slowdown. And we've seen different markets push and pull beef and pork really to a large degree based on what's happening in those other countries. And China and Mexico have been two of those big ones. And so what's happening in their countries economically, how the dropping of zero tolerance for COVID is the big deal for China and has been really a big growth market for the U.S. even despite those policies. And so I would expect, that to continue to grow in the short term potentially. But then the other things that we've been dealing with for years now, African swine fever and COVID and other things. And so in agriculture, seasonality does determine a lot of things. But in the last 3 to 4 years, now we're in year 4, I guess, the volatility has really not made those trends as obvious as they sometimes are. And cattle's a great example. The price trends in cattle have not followed really seasonal patterns for the last couple of years. We did get a big report on Friday with cattle on feed. That has come closer to normal seasonal trends, but we're in a contraction phase. And so that has its own tendencies as well. One of the things that I noticed on cattle on feed is that the numbers weren't surprising, right? They were right in the middle, basically, of what pre-report estimates thought, very close to what those averages were. Pretty much placements are down. And we would have expected them to be down at some point based on what we saw earlier or late last year. And that's taken cattle on feed to about 3% below a year ago. So this is the January 1 number. And what we're going to see is continued declines of that on feed number because we've probably already placed a large degree of the 2022 craft crop. And we're going to be heading into 2023 with probably not that much inventory off feed. And so the question is maybe how low does that inventory number get over the summer? And if you look at 2011, 12, 13, you were looking at maybe a 1 to 1.3 million head decline between January 1 and maybe some of those summer months. That's the pattern we might expect in 2023. That will take cattle on feed closer to 9 million head, which will create a pretty big hole in terms of the cattle supply chain. But all kinds of things can happen between now and then. Placements are drought. And January 1 cattle inventory is upcoming, and it's going to be next week. And that'll give us a better picture of what's off feed, what's still out in the country, and what's available.
Well, more to come on that. Like you said, that report dropping January 31st, so stay tuned, folks. But Katelyn, as always, thank you so much for the insight you provide. I always enjoy our conversation, and I know listeners do as well, so thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Katelyn McCullock. She's the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, joining us for this week's Cattle Market Update. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today, and we are joined now by two guests. Bruno Pedreira is our southeastern area agronomist, as well as Sarah Lancaster, our weed science specialist here at K-State. So first and foremost, before we get into things, guys, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Samantha.
Thanks as always, Samantha.
Absolutely. So I'm especially grateful for your time today because as we're talking, as this is airing, you guys are currently at the weed management schools for Eastern Kansas. But we're going to continue a little bit more into some other opportunities coming up. But as we're speaking, you guys are currently in Ottawa. And then tomorrow you will be in Bronson and Parsons, which are great opportunities to learn more about weed management going into 2023. So I think you guys do these every year about this time of year, right? What's the significance of these programs in y'all's eyes?
Well, I think that's important to put things together, right? And that's part of our effort to work here with Sarah and some of our agents in the eastern part of Kansas. We have been discussing, and weed has been a kind of issue for us. Last year, we went through this drought period, and we are now starting to thinking about the next growing season. And it not seems to be good again. All of the forecast, all of the outlook we have at this point still telling us that we may go through another water limited condition again. I would say that our guys in the west part of the state, they are dealing better with it. Here in the eastern part of the state, we don't do well with it. So we decided to put those schools together to try to talk with our farmers what they can do if they are going to plant corn and beans. And I am actually concerned about our pastures. Since last year, we have been dealing with some armworms, and then we got this drought. Pasture fields, brown fields, none of them are producing as we are expecting. And then we have been seeing some of these pastures kind of thin. So if we do not be prepared to what is coming in 2023, we may not end up with good hay fields by the end of the year.
Bruno, that's what you're going to be focusing on at this event is how to manage those thinning fields, like you said. So some tips that you're going to be sharing with producers at these meetings?
Yes. We need to be focused on what we have. I want to know more about soil fertility in all of these fields so we can have a nice nutrient management protocol. We need to know when we are going to apply fertilizers or not. And some of these is if we already have been seeing weeds on it, we need to control them. We need to identify what kind of weeds we have, and what degree are they there. Are they heavy at this point? Is a kind of field that we can save or we need to replant? If we are going to replant, what would be the plan for these fields? And also, thinking about, we need to think about the animals at this point as well. If you need these pests, you need this hay to feed your animals. I'm concerned about the forage budget on the whole farm. So those are things that we want to consider in these weed schools, because if you think that you are not going to have the forage you need, we may need to think about spring crops or summer animals, or maybe even fall forage if we go through the growing season without the amount of rain we are expecting.
Definitely an important topic to cover for sure, and one that producers will get a lot out of, I know. So, Sarah, I know you're also going to be sharing a very important discussion as well. You're going to be discussing timely tips for planning for 2023, especially when it comes to the crop world. So let's talk about some of the things you'll cover.
Yeah, so I've got a list of 4 things that have been kind of on my mind as I think about farmers getting ready to kill the weeds in their corn, soybeans, and wheat in 2023. And really those 4 things are addressing some questions that I've been getting about kind of lingering supply chain concerns. We had some pretty significant upsets in the supply chain last year, but most of those have worked their way through. The second item on the list, as Bruno alluded to, is going to be thinking about how to deal with this continuing drought. Some things for folks to consider there, especially as related to getting pre-emergence herbicides to work. And the third thing, I kind of joke that it's not a good weed science talk unless you say the word resistance. So we'll talk a little bit about herbicide resistance and some updates and reminders and challenges there. And then the last thing on the list will be some comments and some ideas about the changing regulatory environment for getting herbicides registered. And there are going to be some changes coming down the road for some really important products in the near future.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure that will lead to some very engaging discussions at these events, and producers aren't going to want to miss out on that, because that's another part of it too, is it's not just an opportunity to learn from you guys directly, it's an opportunity to learn from each other too and hear what's working and what's not. So great chance.
Hey, I'm sorry to step on you, Samantha. I even have a survey that I'm going to ask folks to fill out in the room, live and in person. So bring your cell phones, you'll get to use them.
Yeah, absolutely. Do some learning from producers as well. Excellent. So like I mentioned, these aren't the only events that are going to be occurring when it comes to weed management in the near future. So again, those events occurring today as we're speaking is Ottawa. It's from 7 to 9 p.m. So maybe if you're listening this morning and you're like, oh, I want to attend that last minute, there's still an opportunity there. But then tomorrow at Bronson, so from 7 to 9 a.m. this time around, and then in Parsons from 11:30 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. So really encouraging listeners to attend those. And then I understand you're not stopping there. You guys are continuing and moving a little more south and more central to the state and continuing in February. So tell me a bit about those events.
So there's going to be another kind of more Eastern focused, South Central Kansas focused school in Mulvane. That is going to be on February 13th at 1 p.m. That's going to be at the Pix Community Center in Mulvane. And then the agents out west, actually, they also have a series of weed schools that's going to be coming up. And that's going to be February 15th and 16th. And the locations for those are going to be Sharon Springs, Atwood, Kensington, and Russell. So that'll be a little different lineup, little different program, but still very much focused on weed management.
Excellent. And like I said, a little last minute for the ones occurring today and tomorrow. But if listeners are still wanting to register or let somebody know that they're coming or looking for more information, where can they find that at?
Well, we have all of it in our e-update, so they can go through our Department of Agronomy e-update webpage, and they will find all of the details out there.
Wonderful. And I'll link to that as well in the show notes of today's show, which can be found on agtoday.net as always. So if you're looking for that, be sure to check it out on our page. But you two, thank you so much for your time. I shouldn't have favorites, but 2 of my favorite people to chat with. So thank you so much for your time today and enjoy those meetings.
Thank you so much for having us here.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Bruno Pedreira. He is our southeastern area agronomist, as well as Sarah Lancaster, our weed science specialist here at K-State, joining us to share some information on upcoming weed management schools and what they'll be discussing at those. Before we cut to a short break, let's pause for a quick wheat scoop from our friend at the Kansas Wheat Commission, Mary Marsh.
2 key wheat meetings in late January will offer growers the chance to hear projections for the upcoming Farm Bill negotiations from national policymakers, newsmakers, and a market analysis, and weigh in on policies impacting the wheat industry. The 2023 Kansas Commodity Classic The annual convention of the Kansas Corn, Wheat, Soybean, and Grain Sorghum Associations will return to Salina on January 27th at the Hilton Garden Inn. This year's event will be emceed by nationally acclaimed farm broadcaster Greg Akagi from WIBW 580 AM. The Kansas Commodity Classic is hosted by the Kansas Association of Wheat Growers, Kansas Corn Growers Association, Kansas Grain Sorghum Producers Association, and the Kansas Soybean Association. The event begins at 7:30 a.m. with registration and breakfast with a welcome from Kansas Secretary of Agriculture Mike Beam, beginning at 8 a.m. The morning sessions will feature a market update from Dan Maltby with Maltby Risk Management, a U.S. Agriculture in 2023 projection presented by AgriPulse Communications publisher Sarah Wyant, a U.S. Senate update from Senator Jerry Moran, and a House update panel featuring congressional staff. Following lunch in the afternoon session includes a Farm Bill and Farm Programs update from National Association staff and a U.S. Senate update from Senator Roger Marshall. The event will conclude at 2 p.m. Thanks to support from sponsors, including Platinum sponsors Indigo Ag and the Kansas Bankers Association, the event is free to attend. Pre-registration is encouraged by visiting www.kansascommodityclassic.com. One day ahead of the larger convention, members of the Kansas Association of Wheat Growers, COG, will meet separately to discuss COG activities and priorities. The annual meeting will take place at 3 p.m. on January 26th at Kansas Wheat Innovation Center in Manhattan. COG members will also have the opportunity to attend in person or via Zoom, and virtual attendance information will be emailed to members ahead of the event. This year, we made sure Kansas wheat growers' voices were heard over a broad spectrum of issues, Shanna DeGroat, COG Director of Membership and Governmental Affairs, said. COG is proud to give our farmers a voice and keep you informed on the events around the world. During the policy resolution session, COG members will discuss and debate policies specifically impacting wheat growers. Read the current set of COG resolutions at kswheat.com/COG resolutions. Need to renew or sign up for a COG membership? Membership benefits include a weekly update with state and national news in addition to weekly market analysis, the monthly Wheat Farmer Row Crop Farmer newsletter, and the annual guide to wheat varieties for Kansas and the Great Plains. Learn more or pay for your membership at kswheat.com/COG. With Kansas Wheat, this is Mary Marsh.
Once again, that was Mary Marsh with the Kansas Wheat Commission, sharing information on 2 upcoming meetings for Kansas growers. When we return, we'll hear from K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Specialist Joe Gerken. We'll be talking about an animal near and dear to my own heart due to my Auburn University roots, the bald eagle. So stay tuned for that ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are ending today's programming with our wildlife segment for the week, and joining us for that this week is K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Specialist Joe Gerken. So, Joe, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. So today you wanted to start off by describing a cool situation you found yourself in not too long ago.
Yeah, so I was sitting out on the river. My wife and I own a little piece of land that is on the river, the Kansas River. And so I was down there watching some bald eagles fly, and they flew up to a nest. And I thought, man, that'd be a fun thing to talk about on the radio segment. So here we are. Hopefully it's a good segment.
Absolutely. Nothing more picturesque than a bald eagle in flight. So definitely something worthwhile talking about. So we wanted to start with, obviously, a description of the history of bald eagles, how their population kind of crashed. But it's been a good story so far, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of us know the story. You know, in the 1950s, 1960s, populations of bald eagles and golden eagles really crashed. And so they weren't in Kansas for about 20 or 30 years, from the 60s up until 1989. We didn't have any documented nesting pairs of bald eagles in Kansas. So they returned in 1989. We had a couple pairs, and now we have about 3,000 nesting pairs that overwinter in Kansas. So quite the success story, coming back from almost gone to 3,000 that we know about today.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll talk a little bit more about their nesting habits and how they lead to Kansas here in a moment. But also a fun fact for those listening, from Auburn is where I was from, Auburn University. These golden eagles, bald eagles, they're an important part of our history at Auburn. There are war eagles, if you know the term war eagle. So anyways, moving on. The connection to Kansas, they overwinter here and they keep the same nests forever?
Yeah, so generally, not every pair does this, but most pairs come down from Canada and they overnest here. So they add on to their nests every year. And so it keeps getting bigger and bigger the longer that they're here. Bald eagles come down in late fall, and you'll see them stick around through generally March. But they're having their babies, trying to grow their babies up, and you'll see them along the river or along areas that have open water.
Wonderful. So now's a good time to try and scope out some bald eagles, right? And you mentioned water there. That's a key part of their movement, I guess?
Yeah, so a majority of bald eagle diet is fish. And so they're often found around open waters. You know, we see them up in Alaska around the ocean a lot, but around Kansas, you'll see them in lakes, reservoirs, anywhere that there's open water, big rivers. And so they're down there, they're fishing, catching food. They'll also scavenge, but primarily they're finding those fish and eating that as part of their diet.
Wonderful. And you mentioned right now they're kind of raising their young in the process of doing that. And you kind of know when they reach maturity just visually, right?
Yeah, so they probably are having eggs about now, laying their eggs, and then those will mature, and they generally hatch in the middle of February. And we see about a month or so, middle of March is when they take off, hopefully with those fledglings going up to Canada. But when they're born, and for the first year or two of their life, they're completely brown. They start to have a mottled color, and then that picturesque white head of the bald eagle, generally around year 5 is when we start to see, what we would think of as the picturesque bald eagle. They have their full plumage, but it takes about 5 years for them to get there.
Wow. So that's interesting, something to look out for if you're scoping these birds out. But just some reminders when you're looking at these animals to keep a safe distance, one, but also that there's still some illegal actions when we're thinking about bald eagles and golden eagles.
Yeah, so their populations have rebounded enough that they're no longer threatened or endangered, but they are still protected. There's an Eagle Protection Act that the Fish and Wildlife Service monitors, and that basically says you can't do anything to harm them, so you can't go up to their nests and disrupt their nests. You can't catch or capture a bald eagle. You can't even own the feather of a bald eagle. So, you can go out, you can take pictures, but that's all you can really take from the bald eagles. Other than that, we just need to enjoy watching them and having them in Kansas.
Yes, and what a gift they are to be able to observe this time of year. Such a fun creature to watch and majestic, of course.
Yes, they definitely are.
Wonderful, Joe. Well, this has been a super fun conversation. And if listeners are looking for more information on bald eagles, where can they find that at?
Yeah, so definitely start with your local extension agent. They have lots of resources. The Audubon Society is fantastic. Fish and Wildlife Service also has a lot of information about bald eagles, where to find them in the area. So start there.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Joe, for joining us for this conversation today.
Yep. Thanks for having me, as always.
Absolutely. Once again, that was K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Specialist Joe Gerken, ending today's show with a conversation on bald eagles. We'll be back with more tomorrow on Agriculture Today.